Hegel, Philosophy of Mind, Section 2, The Objective of Mind, Subsection C, The Moral Life or Social Ethics, Die Sittlichkeit, Metasection CC, The State. Encyclopedia section 525, The state is the self-conscious, ethical substance, the unification of the family principle with that of civil society. The same unity which is in the family as a feeling of love is its essence, receiving, however, at the same time, through the second principle of conscious and spontaneously active volition, the form of conscious universality. The universal principle, the Catholic principle, with all its evolution in detail, is the absolute aim and content of the knowing subject, which thus identifies itself in its volition with the system of reasonableness. Encyclopedia section 536. The state is, quantum section alpha, its inward structure as a self-relating development, constitutional inner state, law. Quantum section beta, a particular individual, and therefore in connection with other particular individuals, international, outer state law. Quantum section gamma, but these particular minds are only stages in the general development of mind in its actuality, universal history. Hegel, Philosophy of Mind, Section 2, The Objective of Mind, Subsection C, The Moral Life or Social Ethics, Die Sittlichkeit, Metasection CC, The State, Quantum Section Alpha, Constitutional Law, and that is Staatsrecht. Encyclopedia section 537. The essence of the state is the universal, self-originated and self-developed, the reasonable spirit of will, but as self-knowing and self-actualizing, sheer subjectivity, and as an actuality, one individual. Its work generally, in relation to the extreme of individuality as the multitude of individuals, consists in a double function. First, it maintains them as persons, thus making right a necessary actuality. Then it promotes their welfare, which each originally takes care of for himself, but which has a thoroughly general side. It protects the family and guides civil society. Secondly, it carries back both, and the whole disposition and action of the individual, whose tendency is to become a center of his own, into the life of the universal substance, and in this direction, as a free power, it interferes with those subordinate spheres and retains them in substantial eminence. Encyclopedia section 538. The laws express the special provisions for objective freedom. First, to the immediate agent, his independent self-will and particular interests, they are restrictions. But secondly, they are an absolute final end and the universal work. Hence, they are a product of the functions of the various orders, which parallel themselves more and more out of the general particularizing and are a fruit of all the acts and private concerns of individuals. Thirdly, they are the substance of the volition of individuals, which volition is thereby free, and of their disposition, being as such exhibited as current usage. Encyclopedia section 539, as a living mind. The state only is as an organized whole, differentiated into particular agencies, which, proceeding from the one notion, though not known as notion, of the reasonable will, continually produce it as their result. The Constitution is this articulation or organization of state power. It provides for the reasonable will insofar as it is in the individuals only implicitly the universal will, coming to a consciousness and an understanding of itself, and being found also for that will being put in actuality. Through the action of the government and its several branches, and not left to perish, but protected both against their casual subjectivity and against that of the individual. The Constitution is existent justice, the actuality of liberty in the development of the Constitution is existent justice, the actuality of liberty in the development all its reasonable provisions. Liberty and equality are the simple rubrics into which is frequently concentrated what should form the fundamental principle, the final aim and result of the Constitution. However true this is, the defect of these terms is their utter abstractness. If stuck to it, however true this is, the defect of these terms is their utter abstractness. If stuck to in this abstract form, they are principles which either prevent the rise of the concreteness of the state, in essence, its articulation into a constitution and a government in general, or destroy them. With the state there arises inequality, the difference of governing powers and of governed, magistracies, authorities, directories, and similar institutions. The principle of equality, logically carried out, rejects all differences, and thus allows no sort of political condition to exist. Liberty and equality are indeed the foundation of the state, but as the most abstract, also the most superficial, and for that very reason, naturally the most familiar. It is important, therefore, to study them closer. As regards, first, equality, the familiar proposition, all men are by nature equal, blunders by confusing the natural with the notion. It ought rather to read, by nature men are only unequal. But the notion of liberty, as it exists as such, without further specification and development, is abstract subjectivity as a person capable of property. See Encyclopedia section 488. This single abstract feature of personality constitutes the actual equality of human beings. But that this freedom should exist, that it should be man, and not as in Greece, Rome, and other places, some men, that is recognized and legally regarded as a person is so little by nature that it is rather only a result and product of the consciousness of the deepest principle of mind, and of the universality and expansion of this consciousness. That the citizens are equal before the law contains a great truth, but which so expressed is a tautology. It only states that the legal status in general exists, that the laws rule. But as regards the concrete, the citizens, besides their personality, are equal before the law only in these points when they are otherwise equal outside the law. Only that equality which, in whatever way it be, they, as it happens, otherwise have in property, age, physical strength, talent, skill, and other traits, or even in crime, can and ought to make them deserve equal treatment before the law. Only it can make them, as regards taxation, military service, eligibility to office, and other liabilities, punishment, and other responses, equal in the concrete. The laws themselves, except in so far as they concern that narrow circle of personality, presuppose unequal conditions and provide for the unequal legal duties and appurtenances resulting therefrom, or appurtenances resulting therefrom. As regards liberty, it is originally taken partly in a negative sense against arbitrary intolerance and lawless treatment, partly in the affirmative sense of subjective freedom, but this freedom is allowed great latitude both as regards the agent's self will and action for his particular ends, and as regards his claim to have a personal intelligence and a personal share in general affairs. Formerly, the legally defined rights, private as well as public rights of a nation, town, and similar divisions, were called its liberties. Really, even, really, every general, really, every genuine law is a liberty. It contains a reasonable principle of objective mind. In other words, it embodies a liberty. Nothing has become, on the contrary, more familiar than the idea that each must restrict his liberty in relation to the liberty of others, that the state is a condition of such reciprocal restriction, and that the laws are restrictions to such habits of mind. Liberty is viewed as only causal good pleasure and self will. Hence, it has also been said that modern nations are only susceptible of equality, or of equality more than liberty, and that for no other reason than that, with an assumed definition of liberty, chiefly the participation of all in political affairs and actions, it was impossible to make ends meet in actuality, which is at once more reasonable and more powerful than abstract presuppositions. On the contrary, it should be said that it is just the great development and maturity of form in modern states which produces the supreme concrete equality. On the contrary, it should be said that it is just the great development and maturity of form in modern states which produces the supreme concrete inequality of individuals in actuality. While, through the deeper reasonableness of laws and the greater stability of the legal state, it gives rise to greater and more stable liberty, which it can, without incompatibility, allow. Even the superficial distinction of the words liberty and equality points to the fact that the former tends to inequality, whereas, on the contrary, the current notions of liberty only carry us back to equality. But the more we for, but the more we fortify liberty as security of property, as possibility for each to develop and make the best of his talents and good qualities, the more it gets taken for granted. And then the sense of appreciation of liberty especially turns in a subjective direction. By this is meant the liberty to attempt action on every side, and to throw oneself at pleasure in action for particular and for general intellectual interests, the removal of all checks on the individual particularity, as well as the inward liberty in which the subject has principles, has an insight and conviction of his own, and thus gains moral independence. But this liberty itself, on one hand, implies that supreme differentiation in which men are unequal and make themselves more unequal by education. And on another, it only grows up under conditions of that objective liberty and is and could to such height only in modern states. If with this development of particularity there be simultaneous and endless increase of the numbers of wants, and of the difficulty of satisfying them, of the lust of argument and the fancy of detecting faults, with its insatiate vanity, it is all but part of that indiscriminating relaxation of individuality in this sphere which generates all possible complications, and must deal with them as it can. Such a sphere is, of course, also the field of restrictions, because liberty is there under the taint of natural self will and self pleasing, and has therefore to restrict itself, and that not merely with regard to the naturalness, self will, and self conceit of others, but especially and essentially with regard to reasonable liberty. The term political liberty, however, is often used to mean formal participation in the public affairs of state by the will and action even of those individuals who otherwise find their chief function in the particular aims and business of civil society, and it has in part become usual to give the title Constitution only to the side of the state which concerns such participation of these individuals in general affairs, and to regard a state in which this is not formally done as a state without a constitution. On this use of the term, the only thing to remark is that by constitution must be understood the determination of rights and essence of liberties in general, and the organization of the actualization of them, and that political freedom in the above sense can in any case only constitute a part of it. Of it, the following paragraph will speak. Encyclopedia section 540. The guarantee of a constitution, in essence, the necessity that the laws be reasonable and their actualization secured, lies in the collective spirit of the nation, especially in the specific way in which it is itself conscious of its reason. Religion is that consciousness in its absolute substantiality. But the guarantee lies also at the same time in the actual organization or development of that principle in suitable institutions. The Constitution presupposes that consciousness of the collective spirit, and conversely, that spirit presupposes the Constitution, for the actual spirit only has a definite consciousness of its principles in so far as it has them actually exist before it. The, the question, to whom, to what authority, and how organized belongs the power to make a constitution, is the same as the question, who has to make the spirit of a nation? Separate our idea of a constitution from that of the collective spirit, as if the latter exists or has existed without a constitution. And your fancy only proves how superficially you have apprehended the nexus between the spirit and its self consciousness and in its actuality. What is thus called making a constitution is, just because of this inseparability, a thing that has never happened in history, just as little as the making of a code of laws. A constitution only develops from the natural spirit identically with the spirit's own development, and runs through at the same time with it the grades of formation and the alterations required by its concept. It is the indwelling spirit and the history of the nation, and, be it added, the history is only the spirit's history by which constitutions have been and are made. Encyclopedia section 541. The really living totality, that which preserves, in other words, continually produces the state in general and its constitution, is the government. The organization which natural necessity gives is seen in the rise of the family and of the estates of civil society. The government is the universal part of the Constitution, in essence, the part which intentionally aims at preserving those parts, but at the same time gets hold of and carries out those general aims of the whole which rise above the function of the family and of civil society. The organization of the government is likewise its differentiation into powers, as their peculiarities have a basis in principle, yet without that difference losing touch with the actual unity they have in the notion's subjectivity. As the most obvious category of the notion are those of the universality and individuality and their relationship, that of subsumption, the individual under universal. It has come about that in the state the legislative and executive power have been so distinguished as to make the former exist apart as the absolute superior, and to subdivide the latter again into administrative government power and judicial power, according as the laws are applied to public or private affairs. The division of these powers has been treated as the condition of political equilibrium, meaning by division their independence one of another in existence, subject always, however, to the above mentioned subsumption of the powers of the individual under the powers of the general. The theory of such division unmistakably implies the elements of the notion, but so combined by understanding as to result in an absurd collocation instead of the self re the theory of such division unmistakably implies the elements of the notion, but so combined by understanding as to result in an absurd collocation instead of the self read integration of the living spirit. The one essential canon to make liberty deep and real is to give every business belonging to the general interests of the state a separate organization wherever they are essentially distinct. Such real division must be, for liberty is only deep when it is differentiated in all its fullness and these differences manifested in existence. But to make the business of legislation an independent power to make it the first power, with the further proviso that all citizens shall have part therein, and the government be merely executive independent, presupposes ignorance that the true idea, and therefore the living and spiritual actuality, is the self-read integrating notion. In other words, the subjectivity which contains in it universality as only one of its moments, a mistake still greater if it goes with the fancy that the Constitution and the fundamental laws were still one day to make. In a state of society which includes an already existing development of differences, individuality is the first and supreme principle which makes itself fall through the state's organization. Individuality is the first and supreme principle which makes itself fall through the state's organization. Only through the government, and by its embracing in itself the particular businesses, including the abstract legislative business, which taken apart is also particular, is the state one. These, as always, are the terms on which the different elements essentially and alone truly stand toward each other in the logic of reason, as opposed to the external footing they stand on in understanding, which never gets beyond subsuming the individual and particular under the universal. What disorganizes the unity of logical reason equally disorganizes actuality. What disorganizes the unity of logical reason equally disorganizes actuality. Encyclopedia section 542. In the government, regarded as organic totality, the sovereign power principate is a. Subjectivity as the infinite self-unity of the notion in its development. Or I should say, Encyclopedia section 542. In the government, regarded as organic totality, the sovereign power principate is, infrasection A, subjectivity as the infinite self-unity of the notion in its development, the all-sustaining, all-decreeing will of the state, the all-sustaining, all-decreeing will of the state, its highest peak and all-pervasive unity. In the perfect form of the state in which each and every element of the notion has reached free existence, this subjectivity is not a so-called moral person or a decree issuing from a majority, forms in which the unity of the decreeing will has not an actual existence, but an actual individual, the will of a decreeing individual, monarchy. The monarchical constitution is therefore the constitution of developed reason. All other constitutions belong to lower grades of the development and realization of reason, and as a result become elements of the monarchical empire. The unification of all concrete state powers into one existence, as in the patriarchal society, or as in a democratic constitution, the participation of all in all affairs, impugns the principle of the division of powers. In essence, the developed liberty of the constituent factors of the idea, but no whit less must the division, the working out of these factors each to a free totality, be reduced to ideal unity, in essence to subjectivity. The mature differentiation or realization of the idea means, essentially, that this subjectivity should grow to be a real moment, an actual existence, and this actuality is not otherwise than as the individuality of the monarch, the subjectivity of abstract and final decision existent in one person. All those forms of collective decreeing and willing, a common will which shall be the sum of the resultant on aristocratical or democratical principles of the atomistic of single wills, have on them the mark of the unreality of an abstraction. 2 points only are all important. First, to see the necessity of each of the notional factors, and secondly, the form in which it is actualized. It is only the nature of the speculative notion which can really give light on the matter. That subjectivity being the moment which emphasizes the need of abstract deciding in general, partly leads on to the proviso that the name of the monarch appear as the bond and sanction under which everything is done in the government. Partly being simple self relation has attached to it the characteristic of immediacy and then of nature, whereby the destination of individuals for the dignity of the princely power is fixed by inheritance. Encyclopedia section 543, infrasection B. In the particular government power there emerges, first, the division of state business into its branches, otherwise defined: legislative power, administration of justice, or judicial power, administration and police, and its consequent distribution between particular boards or officers, which, having their business appointed by law, to that end and for that reason possess independence of action without at the same time ceasing to stand under higher supervision. Secondly, two, there arises the participation of several in state business who together constitute the general order. Remember section, Encyclopedia section 528. Secondly, too, there arises the participation of several in-state business who together constitute the general order insofar as they take on themselves the charge of universal ends as the essential function of their particular life. The further condition for being able to take individually part in this business being a certain training, aptitude, and skill for such ends. Encyclopedia section 544. The Estates Collegium, or Provincial Council, is an institution by which all such as belong to civil society in general and are to that degree private persons participate in the governmental power, especially in legislation. Viewed as such, legislation as concerns the universal scope of those interests which do not, like peace and war, involve the, as it were, personal interference and action of the state as one man, and therefore do not belong specially to the province of the sovereign power. By virtue of this participation, subjective liberty and conceit, with their general opinion, can show themselves palpably efficacious and enjoy the satisfaction of feeling themselves to count for something. The division of constitutions into democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy is still the most definite statement of their difference in relation to sovereignty. They must at the same time be regarded as necessary structures in the path of development, in short, in the history of the state. Hence, it is superficial and absurd to represent them as an object of choice. The pure forms necessary to the process of evolution are, insofar as they are finite and in course of change, conjoined both with forms of their degeneration, such as oligarchy or ochlocracy and such, and with earlier transition forms. These two forms are not to be confused with those legitimate structures. Thus, it may be, if we look only to the fact that the will of one individual stands at the head of the state, Oriental despotism is included under the vague name monarchy, as also feudal monarchy, to which indeed even the favorite name of constitutional monarchy cannot be refused. The true difference of these forms from genuine monarchy depends on the true value of those principles of right which are in vogue and have their actuality and guarantee in the state power. These principles are those expounded earlier: liberty of property, and above all, personal liberty, civil society with its industry and its communities, and with regulated efficiency of the particular bureau in subordination to the laws. The question which is most discussed is in what sense we are to understand the participation of private persons in state affairs. For it is as private persons that the members of bodies of estates are primarily to be taken, be they treated as mere individuals or as representatives of a number of people or of the nation. The aggregate of private persons is often spoken of as the nation, but as such an aggregate it is vulgus, not populus. And in this direction, it is the one sole aim of the state that a nation should not come to existence, to power and action as such an aggregate. Such a condition of a nation is a condition of lawlessness, demoralization, brutishness, incest. In it, the nation would only be a shapeless, wild, blind force, like that of the stormy elemental sea, which, however, is not self destructive as the nation, a spiritual element, would be. Yet such a condition may be heard described as that of true freedom. If there is to be any sense in embarking upon the question of the participation of private persons in public affairs, it is not a brutish mass, but an already organized nation, one in which a governmental power exists which should be presupposed. The desirability of such participation, however, is not to be put in the superiority of particular intelligence which private persons are supposed to have over state officials. The contrary may be the case, nor in the superiority of their good will for the general best. The members of civil society, as such, are rather people who find their nearest duty in their private interest, and, as especially in the feudal society, in the interest of their privileged corporation. Take the case of England, which, because private persons have a predominant share in public affairs, has been regarded as having the freest of all constitutions. Experience shows that that country, as compared with the other civilized states of Europe, is the most backward in civil and criminal legislation, in the law and liberty of property, in arrangements for art and science, and that objective freedom or rational right is rather sacrificed to formal right and particular private interests. Please remember that our translator is William Wallace of Scotland, and that this happens even to the institutions and possessions supposed to be dedicated to religion. The desirability of private persons taking part in public affairs is partly to be put in their concrete and therefore more urgent sense of general wants. But the true motive is the right of the collective spirit to appear as an externally universal will, acting with orderly and express efficacy for the public concerns. By this satisfaction of this right, it gets its own life quickened, and at the same time breathes fresh life into the administrative officials who thus have it brought home to them that not merely have they to enforce duties, but also to have regard to rights. Private citizens are in the state the incomparably greater number, and form the multitude of such as are recognized as persons. Hence, the will reason exhibits its existence in them as a preponderating majority of free men, or in its reflectional universality, which has its actuality vouchsafed it as a participation in its sovereignty. Hence, the will reason exhibits its existence in them as a preponderating majority of freemen, or in its reflectional universality, which has its actuality vouchsafed it as a participation in the sovereignty. But it has already been noted as a moment of civil society, Encyclopedia sections 527 and 534, that the individuals rise from external into substantial universality and form a particular kind, the estates. And it is not in the inorganic form of mere individuals as such, after the democratic faction and it is not in the inorganic form of mere individuals as such, after the democratic fashion of elections, and it is not in the inorganic form of mere individuals as such, after the democratic fashion of election, but as organic factors, as estates, that they enter upon that participation in the sovereignty. In the state, a power or agency must never appear and act as a formless, inorganic shape, in essence, basing itself on the principle of multeity and mere numbers. Assemblies of estates have been wrongly designated as legislative power, so far as they form only one branch of that power, a branch in which the special government officials have an ex officio share, while the sovereign power has the privilege of final decision. In a civilized state, moreover, legislation can only be a further modification of existing law, and so called new laws can only deal with minutiae of detail and particularities. See for reference Encyclopedia section 529's note, and can only deal with minutiae of detail and particularities, the main drift of which has been already prepared, are preliminarily settled by the practice of the law courts. The so called financial law, insofar as it requires the assent of the estates, is really a government affair. It is only improperly called a law, in the general sense of embracing a wide, indeed the whole, range of the external means of government. The finances deal with what in their nature are only particular needs, ever newly recurring, even if they touch on the sum total of such needs. In the main part of the requirement, if the main part of the requirement were, as it very likely is, regarded as permanent, the provision for it would have more the nature of a law. But to be a law, it would have to be made once for all, and not be made yearly or every year afresh. As in chemistry, a law is a pattern, not a theory of how things should go. The part which varies according to time and circumstances concerns, in reality, the smallest part of the amount, and the provisions with regard to it have even less the character of a law, and yet it is and may be only this slight variable part which is matter of dispute and can be subjected to a varying yearly estimate. It is this last, then, which falsely bears the high sounding name of the grant, of the budget, in essence, of the whole of the finances. A law for 1 year and made each year has even the plain man something palpable. A law for 1 year and made each year has even to the plain man something palpably absurd. For he distinguishes the essential and developed universal as content of a true law from the reflectional universality which only externally embraces what in its nature is many. To give the name of a law to the annual fixing of financial requirements only serves what the presupposed separation of legislative from executive to keep up the illusion of that separation having real existence, and to conceal the fact that the legislative power, when it makes a decree about finance, is really engaged with strict executive business. But the importance attached to the power of, from time to time, granting supply on the ground that the assembly of estates possesses in it a check on the government, and thus a guarantee against injustice and violence. This importance is, in one way, rather plausible than real. The financial measures necessary for the state's subsistence cannot be made conditional on any other circumstances, nor can the state's subsistence be put yearly in doubt. It would be a parallel absurdity if the government were, ergo, to grant and arrange the judicial institutions always for a limited time merely, and thus, by the threat of suspending the activity of such an institution and the fear of a consequent state of brigandage, reserve for itself a means of coercing private individuals. Then again, the pictures of a condition of affairs in which it might be useful and necessary to have in hand means of compulsion are partly based on the false conception of a contract between rulers and ruled, and partly presupposed the possibility of such a divergence in spirit between these two parties as would make constitution and government quite out of the question. If we suppose the empty possibility of getting help by such compulsive means brought into existence, such help would rather be the derangement and dissolution of the state, in which there would no longer be a government, but only parties, and the violence and oppression of one party would only be helped away by the other. To fit together the several parts of the state into a constitution after the fashion of mere understanding, in essence, to adjust within it the machinery of a balance of powers external to each other, is to contravene the fundamental idea of what a state is. Encyclopedia section 545, The final aspect of the state is to appear in immediate actuality as a single nation marked by physical conditions. As a single individual, it is exclusive against other like individuals. In their mutual relations, waywardness and chance have a place, for each person in the aggregate is autonomous. The universal of law is only postulated between them, and not actually existent. This independence of a central this independence of a central authority reduces disputes between them to terms of mutual violence, a state of war, to meet which the general estate in the community assumes the particular function of maintaining the state's independence against other states and becomes the estate of bravery. Encyclopedia section 546 and the end of quantum section alpha of meta section CC. This state of war shows the omnipotence of the state in its individuality, an individuality that goes even to abstract negativity. Country and fatherland then appear as the power by which the particular independence of individuals and their absorption in the external existence of possession and in natural life is convicted of its own nullity, as the power which procures the maintenance of the general substance by the patriotic sacrifice on the part of these individuals of this natural and particular existence, so making nugatory the nugatoriness that confronts it.